Greetings from the Southern Hemisphere. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today about multicultural education or polycultural education. My name's Gary Shaw and I work for the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development. I work in a unit called the Multicultural Education and Global Citizenship Unit, which gives you a kind of flavour for the work that we do. What I'd like to do in this session is to address three key questions that I think have arisen in my viewing of the presentations at the symposium. And these include what is polycultural or multicultural education, and I'll try and do that from an Australian context. What are the aims and expectations of multicultural education, and what are the approaches and strategies that are used for successful outcomes in multicultural education. I'd just like to set the scene a little bit just by giving a little bit of context to whereabouts in the Southern Hemisphere I am. In fact, I'm in the state of Victoria, which is the second most populated state in the country. Overall there are 22.3 million people. And of those, 27% have been born overseas. Australia is fundamentally a nation of migrants. Everybody has a migration story. In Victoria, we have people from nearly 200 nations who speak more than 180 languages and practice more than 116 religions. So there's a lot of diversity in Victoria and across Australia more broadly. Multiculturalism was first introduced into Australia in the 1970s following a wave of European migration post Second World War and as a way to promote assimilation, that is for the migrants to be more like the majority culture. We've found that that has shifted quite a lot in the last 40 years or so. So we no longer promote assimilation. One of the criticisms of multiculturalism is it tends to treat diversity as a problem rather than an asset, and it often forces the other to change, and rather than to see that as an opportunity for all Australians to become more culturally aware, more culturally literate. So policies no longer favour this notion of assimilation, with the view that cultural diversity, including an understanding of our own culture, an own cultural background, brings benefit locally and more broadly supports a contemporary internationalised view of the world and Australia's place in it. Citizenship has been used as a great kind of integrating instrument by the Australian government, I guess by most migrant societies such as the US and Canada. While taking out citizenship by itself doesn't guarantee social cohesion, peace and harmony, it's a powerful mechanism because it focuses on values and not ethnicity. That's a really important point, and one that we've built on in terms of a number of educational programs. Civics and citizenship education and values education in school has been very helpful in forming understandings of democracy, human rights and social justice. And these efforts are strengthened, we've found, by providing opportunities for young people to be active participants in the development of their awareness of citizenship and their engagement with citizenship. Victoria has pursued an overt multicultural policy agenda over successive governments since the 1970s. And this has been reinforced recently with a new government passing the Multicultural Victoria Bill, in which the principles of multiculturalism are framed around the logic of shared values, relationship building and mutual benefit from diversity. That is, multiculturalism is not just for migrants, as perceived in the past policies, but as benefit for everybody. It is more than just learning about other cultures, but it's to develop a sustainable way of living together, developing understanding, respect and dialogue between groups. Multicultural policies and legislation in Victoria express the right to express one's own culture and beliefs, and involves a reciprocal responsibility to accept the right of others to express their views and values within the law. With such a diverse culture, Australia obviously has a number of challenges. We know that there are significant discriminatory behaviours. Some research conducted by the University of Western Sydney across a 12-year period involving more than 12,000 participants indicates that for the most part, people agree that there is benefit in treating everybody equally. However, we also identified that there are a significant number of people who are experiencing prejudice and discriminatory behaviour, and this tends to occur quite a lot in education. So this is an area that we're trying to focus on, and there are significant efforts being made to develop teacher capacity and confidence in trying to address prejudice, to develop intercultural understandings, intercultural competence. I'd like to briefly talk about some of the promising approaches that we've been using in the last few years. In Victoria, we've focused on a strategy called Education for Global and Multicultural Citizenship, which promotes more outward-looking schools rather than focus on citizenship at a local level. It's an attempt for the students to see themselves more in a global context. Some of the best investments that we've made include a curriculum and research focus on intercultural understanding, citizenship education with an emphasis on the use of student-centred approaches, student voice and youth agency, promoting global perspectives, particularly on studies of Asia, bringing a regional perspective into the curriculum, and professional learning for principals, administrators and teachers, as well as providing citizenship activities for students and general capacity building strategies for regions. These approaches have been developed using evidence-based research, particularly that based on values education in Australian schools over the last 8 years or so, and also a focus on social emotional learning. What we found is that where students are actively involved in the constructing their own educational experience, when they're involved in decision making within their school, when they feel that they are connected to their education, it makes an enormous difference as to the way in which they engage with ideas and concepts such as intercultural understanding, global citizenship. So this is a very important approach that is based on evidence and works well. We find that this idea of youth agency, where young people feel a connection to the educational experience, and we develop the skills and the knowledge in which they use to participate in their school experience. In practical terms, this means things like students participating in Model United Nations conferences, in regional and state conventions, student forums. This is at primary and secondary level, where students are actively engaged in discussing contemporary social issues, particularly things like refugee rights, human rights, Indigenous rights, social justice. Students engage with those kind of ideas and concepts by developing an understanding of the issues and then developing problem-solving approaches. What can we do about this? How can we make our communities better, more engaging, more with less bullying, less discrimination? So where the students are active participants in this process, the outcomes tend to be far greater. Values education has been a really important element of a lot of work we do in multicultural education. Fundamentally, it enables schools and their communities to engage in discussion about values that are important to them. There is a national framework and there are nine national values, but these aren't mandated. They give guidance to school communities to talk about the educational experience and what they would like from the school and what expectations they have of the students. Where you engage the students in that dialogue, where they are helping to construct the core values that the school will operate by, it provides a really important foundation for further work on intercultural understanding and developing ways that can overcome dissidence. So if there are disputes within the school, going back to the core values that people have agreed on makes a huge difference as to whether they'll achieve a positive outcome and reduce dissonance. The standpoints reflect transformation. What you'd expect from a school that was promoting intercultural understanding, that was socially cohesive, that there would be evidence of equality, inclusion, social justice principles practiced. The students would be taking responsibility for their own behaviour. They would be treating each other with respect. That's where we hope to get to with a focus on intercultural understanding using the 5 standpoints. In simple terms, the first standpoint is really about cultural integration, assimilation, being more like us, suppression of cultural identity. The second standpoint is taking a little bit more interest in intercultural understanding, celebrating other cultures, maybe some interactions, but really it's not much more than just identifying cultural difference. The third one, relational understandings, focus on changing individual negative attitudes or feelings towards people that are perceived as being different and creating some harmony. One of the criticisms of this approach, though, does not critically address social inequalities and discrimination. The fourth one, interactive understandings, values cultural diversity for its positive contribution and encourages students to acquire attitudes and skills that promote respect from different cultures. However, it doesn't always examine social inequalities and discrimination in ways that differences can be, the change occurs and the differences are probably still going to be disruptive. The transformational end really is where we're aiming to get to, and it seeks to understand and challenge structural inequalities. It involves addressing social injustices, challenging racism, prejudice and other forms of discrimination. This approach draws attention to changes that need to happen at an institutional and societal level, not just at an individual level. Right, I'd just like to finish with a couple of things that are currently going on in Australia we think are really important and will be very interesting for people to follow. The first is that the new Australian curriculum is including what's called a general capability called intercultural understanding. Now this is across the curriculum and it's a capability that all students should develop in the length of their school. So it's one of those areas that now has priority on the educational landscape. So that's currently being developed and it is of great interest to schools. The second is a research project that the Victorian Department of Education is involved in on intercultural understanding, and we will be studying quite closely redesign of schools to look at what will strengthen and support intercultural understanding. We'll also be looking at what impedes, what gets in the way, what challenges schools to develop good intercultural understanding. So those two next steps are going to be really interesting, and hopefully will provide further impetus for schools, further advice for schools on how to develop good multicultural education, intercultural understanding.